let me come to our first speaker. This is Jacques Pienaar. So, hi Jacques. Jacques obtained his PhD at the University of Queensland in 2013. He held postdoc positions at IQOQI-Vienna, the Institute for Quantum Optics and Quantum Information in Vienna, and also the Institute of Physics in Natal in Brazil. Now, Jacques is a postdoc in Chris Fuchs' QBism group at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And before letting you speak, let me take the freedom to quote you. So on your webpage, you say something that I found really nice. You said, "What does quantum mechanics tell us about reality?" And then you say, "That's the question that got me started in physics. Now, after 10 years of study, a PhD and 3 postdocs, I can finally say that I have no idea." So I really like this, and I'm looking forward to learn more from you, in what sense we also shouldn't have an idea, or perhaps we should. So in any case, your talk will be on QBism and the embodied agent, and the stage is yours.
Thanks, Markus. Yeah, maybe in that same spirit, this talk is not going to be a talk which will provide many answers. Rather, I'm going to try to open up questions and try to connect it to some things from philosophy. So this will be a much less technical talk and a much more conceptual talk. So I hope you enjoy it. Let me start the presentation. So as Markus said, I'm in Chris Fuchs' QBism group at UMass Boston. And this talk is about QBism and the embodied agent. So to give you an overview of the conceptual structure, I'm going to divide the talk into 3 parts. Part 1 discusses the motivation. Why should we try to formalize agents in QBism? And I'm going to argue that despite the reluctance of QBists to do so, that we need to do so in order to understand the world of those agents. And in particular, that we get to the world of the agents by abstracting the agents away. And you have to formalize the agent before you can abstract it. So once I've motivated the idea of formalizing the agent, we then face the problem of how to do that in QBism. It's not trivial because agents in QBism cannot be treated just like objects, exactly because they are not objects, they're subjects. So to understand the agent, I'm going to argue that we need to understand the concept of other agents. So we have to deal with intersubjectivity. And I'll do that through a case study, which is a little story I like to call Alyosha and the Cat. And that will help us to get a handle on the issues involved in intersubjectivity in QBism. And then based on that, I'm going to make a suggestion that in order to deal with intersubjectivity in QBism, we have to talk about the embodiment of the agent. So that will be in the 3rd part. And that will be very speculative, but I hope you find it stimulating. So let's begin. Why should we define agents in QBism? Now, just to contextualize that, in a nutshell, QBism says that quantum theory is a tool of decision theory. And just like in classical decision theory, it's all about agents who are trying to make predictions about their possible future experiences, like making bets on the outcome of a lottery. And in that scheme of things, the wave function just describes the agent's probability assignments for experiences that they might have in the future. Now, in this context, the concept of agent is an undefined primitive in decision theory. It just refers to whoever is using the theory. And just like a cookbook doesn't supply a definition of who is or isn't a cook, quantum theory, according to QBism, shouldn't have to define who is or isn't an agent. Now, this isn't completely, it's not completely clear how this can work, because one of the consequences is that since in QBism, the measurement outcomes are experiences of the agent who does the measurement, because QBism is a thoroughly first-person interpretation, that means that the measurement apparatus has to be regarded as an extension of the agent's own senses. And I discussed that in a paper of mine from 2020. But one thing which I'm still grappling with, as I'll explain in this talk, is this problem that scientific instruments, as we all know, are public apparatuses, which means that if one agent uses an apparatus, let's say this kibble balance that I have pictured here, to, let's say, to measure Planck's constant, then once they get an outcome or an experience with that apparatus, it's as good as if it happened for other agents. In other words, it's kind of that outcome is shared among all of the scientists. We don't have to personally go and measure it ourselves. We can trust that it's as good as if it happened for us, if an expert does it. So how can we account for this sharing of measurement outcomes in QBism, which is based in a thoroughly first-person account? And QBism has a standard narrative about how we can talk about the world beyond agents just by looking at quantum theory as a decision theory. And the standard argument goes something like this. Quantum theory is like a tool. And by examining the shape of that tool, we should be able to deduce something about how the world, i.e. the ontology, must be in order for that tool to be useful. And in this story, we should be able to make this deduction without defining what agents are using the tool. And here's the way that Chris Fuchs likes to put it, using an evolutionary analogy. And I'm quoting from his paper on participatory realism. He says, any of us can use quantum theory, but only for ourselves. There's a little single-celled thing called a euglena that has a tail coming out of it. The tail arose from evolutionary pressures so that the euglena can move from environments where there are depleted nutrients to environments where there's an abundance of nutrients. It's a tool. Quantum mechanics is like the euglena's tail. It's something we evolved in 1925, and since it's been shown to be such a good tool, we keep using it and we pass it on to our children. The tail is a single user tail. But we can look at the tail and ask things like, what might we learn about the environment by studying its structure? We might notice the tail is not completely circular, and that might tell us something about the viscosity of the medium it's traveling through. We might look at the ratio of the length of it to the width in various places, and that might tell us about features of the environment. So quantum mechanics is a single user theory, but by dissecting it, you can learn something about the world that all of us are immersed in. I really like this story because in a way it shows exactly why we do need to talk about the agent too. Because when you think about it, the tail of the euglena is not only a tool that the euglena uses on its external world, the tail is also part of the euglena's body. At the same time, it's like an object that inhabits the world that the euglena uses to move around, and at the same time it's part of the euglena itself. So by dissecting the tool, say quantum theory, at the same time that it tells us about the world, it has to tell us about the agents that are in that world. You can't do one without the other. If you think about it in terms of archaeology, looking at an ancient tool that was used by an ancient civilization, any inferences you make about what the tool was used for in the environment depends on inferences you make about who was using it and for what purposes. So given that we need to talk about agents in QBism in order to get to some discussion of the world of those agents, we face another issue, which is that we can't think of the world as being ultimately independent of agents, not completely, because that would mean that we could think about the world as having an existence where there are no agents, where agents never existed. And that would be something like a God's eye perspective on the world. And QBism doesn't allow that. QBism remains within a first-person point of view. So what can we do instead? Well, my suggestion is that we can abstract away the agents. So we can try to distill what I'll call the objective residue of the agent's world by thinking about ontology as the world as experienced not by any particular agent, but by no one in particular, by a kind of abstracted anonymous agent who stands in for anyone. And by abstracting away the agents, what we're left with will somehow, its form will depend on the form of the agent. But what's left over will be objective in the sense that it's invariant across agents. So let me try to give you an intuition for how this works. And the point I want to make here is that when I talk about abstracting away the agent, abstraction is actually a constructive process. And I'll explain that using a nice little true story about an artist called Robert Rauschenberg, who you may have heard of because of his famous piece, Erased de Kooning drawing from 1953. One day, Rauschenberg showed up at de Kooning's house, a little bit drunk, with a proposition. And at this time, Rauschenberg was a mostly unknown artist, and de Kooning was completely famous. His drawings would sell for like tens of thousands of dollars. And Rauschenberg proposed to de Kooning that de Kooning would give him one of his famous drawings, and Rauschenberg would erase it. And de Kooning, being a bit of an interesting guy, decided this was a good idea. And he picked a drawing that he especially liked and gave it to Rauschenberg, who painstakingly erased it over the course of about 2 months. And the final result here, you can see, still has a few smudges. He couldn't get rid of everything. But what I thought most interesting about this story is that Rauschenberg said in an interview that he had first tried to just do drawings himself and erase his own drawings. But he said, if it was my own work being erased, then the erasing would be only half of the process, and I wanted it to be the whole. In other words, it was important to him to start with a drawing already made and erase it. And I think it's the same in the case of physics from a QBist point of view. We don't start with an empty world, an empty universe, and populate it with objects that we call agents. We begin already as agents immersed in the world. And we get to the ontology, to the world separate from us, by abstracting ourselves out of the picture. So that's how I want to think about the process of abstraction. Okay, so now we come to part 2. How does intersubjectivity come into this? So the thing is that to abstract away the agent requires us to go from a particular subject, somebody, to an anonymous subject, anybody. And the anybody refers to other subjects, other agents. So we need to understand this relation of intersubjectivity, which means that the fundamental dynamic of QBism is missing a third piece, because usually QBism talks about the relationship between agents and their external world. But actually, there's a third relation here between agents and other agents, and agents, other agents and the world. So that's what I'd like to try to begin talking about. And we immediately run into a deep conceptual problem, which I found out from science writer Amanda Gefter was something. So she studied Wheeler's personal journals in depth. And this was something that really troubled Wheeler. He said, how are acts of observer participancy fitted together? That's the central mystery. Is there any point partway between all and none on this issue? Each of us a private universe? Preposterous. Each of us see the same universe? Also preposterous. Another way to put that is that epistemologically, the problem is, how does an agent A know from their first person point of view that they're participating in one and the same elementary event, that is, that they're sharing an experience with some other agent B? And it seems like we only have two choices. If we take the blue pill, we say that X is a public event. When it happens for one agent, it happens for all agents. Or we take the red pill and we say that the event X is private. When it happens for one agent, it only happens for that agent and no one else. And I agree with Wheeler, neither of these is satisfying. I want a third option. So let me go to my little case study of Alyosha and the cat. Alyosha is a colleague of mine, and when he was at UMass Boston, we had many interesting discussions. And in one of these, he told me a story about how he was caught in the rain one day while going for a walk, and there was nowhere to take shelter. And in desperation, as the water came pouring down, he took shelter under a bridge. And as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw there was a cat there. And the cat looked just as disheveled and damp and unhappy as he did. And they met each other's gaze. They looked at each other, and he felt that in that moment, there was a sense of mutual camaraderie, that something was shared between them. Somehow they shared the same experience. So let me analyze this and see what we can learn from it. So the first lesson here, I think, is that to share an experience between agents doesn't require linguistic or verbal communication. Perhaps we can say something is traded or exchanged between the two, but it's not words. So I think that linguistic communication, as important as it might be in intersubjectivity, is founded on something deeper. It presupposes a pre-linguistic relation between subjects. And later I'm going to connect that to embodiment. Second lesson is that sharing is not identification. So it doesn't make sense to presuppose any kind of literal equivalence between the contents of each agent's perception. And that's because when you think about it, even though the rain is the same rain and the bridge is the same bridge, the actual experiences of Alyosha and the cat will be quite different. We know that their eyes have, are differently constructed. Their vision probably works in a different way. The cat's sense of smell will be much more heightened. Just their different physical sizes means that the cat sees things from down near the ground. So their experiences in the specific details will be completely different. So we have no way of kind of saying that this is literally the same in terms of the details of experience. But actually the problem's even deeper than that. And the third lesson is that actually we cannot even meaningfully compare the two experiences, because we don't have an outside point of view, some kind of super subject who's able to inhabit both the mind of the cat and the mind of Alyosha. We can't say, okay, now I'm Alyosha, this is what it's like, and now I'm the cat, and now I can compare the two. There's no teleportation of consciousness between bodies. So whatever we say about this sharing, it has to be something which clearly Alyosha is able to know that he's sharing this moment with the cat without having to literally become the cat. Okay. And finally, this gets more to a constructive point, that this sharing really depends on the fact that they both have bodies. And it depends on that in two ways. First of all, the fact that the cat is a living body is important. If Alyosha went down there and found a dead cat, there's no way he could feel like we're sharing an experience, right? It just wouldn't work. So it's important that the cat seems alive to him. And the second thing is that it's important that he sees the cat as being in the same predicament as himself, that they're both taking refuge from the rain. They're both creatures who like to be warm and dry and don't like to be wet. And they're both there somewhat against their will. If it were, instead of a cat, let's say a toad hopping along through the puddles, he wouldn't have the sense of shared camaraderie, the sense of sharing an experience, because the toad doesn't mind the rain. And that, of course, again, depends on their bodies. So let me turn now to this issue of embodiment and see how it undergirds intersubjectivity. And here I'm going to start drawing on philosophy because honestly, I don't know where else to turn. Act of desperation. So let me talk a bit about how embodiment might come into QBism. And I can think of two places where it becomes relevant. So in QBism, as I've said, it's all about the experiences of the agent. And it's clear that somehow these experiences must be shaped by the agent's body, their sensory motor capabilities. So the first question is how does that happen exactly? And the second point is, how does a QBist agent model other agents? Because other agents appear to the QBist agent as having bodies also, but these bodies are not just physical systems. they have a different significance. The fact that they're recognized as other agents must mean something. So what specifically does it mean? So let me deal with these one at a time. So firstly, where is the body in QBism? The fundamental QBist event is an agent's experience. And within that experience, we have a pairing of two elements. One is that you have an action that the agent takes, directed, at some phenomenon, and that action singles out a set of possible results. For example, the action might be drawing an arrow in a bow and firing it. And by that action, I'm defining a set of possible results, which are the different places that the arrow might hit the target. And then the result is when one of those possible experiences is actually realized. So the arrow will strike a particular part of the target, and that will realize the result of the agent's action. And my question now is, okay, so this split between the action and the result, well, conceptually, what is the nature of this split? How do we understand where it comes from? I'm going to go through a couple of options and I'm going to reject them, okay? So here's one thing you might think first. Okay, actions, you might say, are internal to the agent's experience, whereas results come from outside. They're, it's the world, it's external to the agent. But actually that doesn't really work in QBism, because in QBism, both the action and the result are part of the agent's experience. By definition, you can think of the action as the part of the experience which I control, more or less, or at least it's connected with my body somehow. So I call it proprioceptive. And results are perceptive. They're what we call the perceptions that go together with that. But both of these are internal in the sense that they're both aspects of that agent's experience. None of them represents a view from outside. So we have to reject that option. So let's try another one. Maybe actions are the voluntary parts of experience and the results are involuntary. For example, you might say, when I voluntarily move my body, that's an action. But what about when the doctor hits my knee with that little hammer and just by reflex, my leg kicks? That's an involuntary action. So it seems like we want to call that an action, but we can't, if we insist that actions have to be voluntary, then we can't do that. And on the flip side of things, results are also not completely involuntary. So while it's true that the agent cannot choose which result happens, for example, they can't perfectly control exactly where the arrow will land in the target, assuming they're a very bad archer. At least they can choose to perform archery instead of bowling, for example, and that does allow them to exert some amount of voluntary control over the set of results. So this voluntary-involuntary split doesn't really fit well with what we mean by action and result in QBism. So we need a third option. And here I'm going to draw on a philosopher who I think is overlooked. He's interesting. So Samuel Todus was an American philosopher who engaged very much with the continental phenomenologists and wrote this very interesting book. And drawing from here, he has two concepts that I think QBism needs. The first is that he talks about localization, which is, it's kind of he calls it bodily poise. It's like you're ready, a readiness in your body. And that kind of indicates a particular set of anticipated experiences. Like firing the arrow, I'm setting myself in a particular physical poise that indicates the possible experiences I might expect to happen. And then he talks about determination, which is when one of those anticipated experiences comes about and I recognize that fulfills one of those anticipations. And I think that fits just perfectly with what QBism means by actions and results. And it's significant that both of these are closely connected to the concept of the body, as Todus explains in his book. Let me turn to the second point. So how does a QBist agent model other agents? Well, the other agent must be experienced as a living body sharing the physical space, as I've argued, and secondly, must be recognized as sharing the same abstract situation in that space. So let me try to drill into these ideas some more. Firstly, this issue of experiencing the other agent as a living body. The point here is that in the case of Alyosha and the cat, the aliveness of the cat must be knowable to Alyosha just by being in its presence and kind of seeing it. The cat's aliveness is expressed in its behavior, but is not hidden behind its behavior. So this is an idea that comes about in phenomenology also. It's that when we recognize other organisms as agents like ourselves, it's not a deductive process. We don't say, here's a physical thing moving around. Let me deduce, oh, it must be, must have a consciousness there. Okay, it's immediately perceptible that it is a living agent. And here's the way that Jean-Paul Sartre puts it in his famous book, Being and Nothingness. He says, I never perceive an arm raised alongside a motionless body. I perceive Pierre who raises his hand. This does not mean that by an act of judgment, I relate the movement of the hand to a consciousness, which instigated it. Rather, I can apprehend the movement of the hand or the arm only as a temporal structure of the whole body. In this sense, the body appears within the limits of the situation as a synthetic totality of life. I think that's beautiful. But what does that mean for QBism? Well, concretely, in QBism, we often say that the agent can model another agent as a physical system, which is true. You absolutely can do that. But when we designate it as another agent rather than just say another object, we're implying that there's more to it than just its objective properties. In QBism, agents take actions on things in their environment and experience results. So when an agent takes an action on another agent, what that means is that the results must be able to signify to the agent the subjective life of the other agent. In other words, the actions that we take on another agent must fall into two categories. One category of actions are the ones where the results just represent the physical responses of the other agent as a body object, like when I hit their knee with a hammer and it kicks, or if I do surgery on the other agent. And the other category of actions are the ones that represent the response of the other agent as a subject, like when I say, how's your day going? Or give the other agent a hug. So let me turn to the second point, that sharing an experience depends on abstracting the situation. The philosopher Merleau-Ponty had an interesting idea that I think is useful here called the body schema. He writes, if my body is no longer only known by a mass of strictly individual sensations, but as an object organized by relationship to its surroundings, the result is that the perception of my body can be transferred to the other, and the other's image can be immediately interpreted by my body schema. That's very cryptic. Unfortunately, Merleau-Ponty is hard to read, but here's how I interpret this idea. You have to remember, Merleau-Ponty was influenced by the experiments on childhood, the theory of childhood development of Piaget. And one of the big ideas here is that a newborn baby doesn't at first recognize or own its own body. Its arms and legs are, out of its control. It first experiences just its body as just one of many bodies in that environment. And so that's what we might call the abstract body schema. It's a set of bodies that are similar in a relevant way. And as the child comes to associate certain proprioceptive feelings with its own movements, it learns that it can control its hands and legs through its will. It begins to differentiate between its own body and other bodies. And at the same time, it develops a consciousness of who it is versus who other beings are. So the split into an ego versus others happens at the same time. And so the concept of my own mind is only meaningful in relation to the existence of other minds. I can't talk about my mind all by itself. Solipsism is impossible in this way of thinking. And it's this idea that there's a previously undifferentiated body schema, which then becomes split into my body versus others, that allows me to say that these bodies are all interchangeable, in a sense that I could have been, in a sense, any of those other bodies. I can, in a sense, put myself in their shoes. So let's get away from philosophy and talk about QBism. In QBism, the idea inspired by this is that every action and result set that an agent can do must be associated to some abstract body schema. So an agent should be able to put themselves in the same shoes, figuratively speaking, as other agents, having the same body schema, and hence can recognize when they're sharing an experience. Now, I'm not saying, as before, that they literally become another agent. I'm saying that they recognize that any other agent in their situation would experience something similar to what they're experiencing. And that's how Alyosha and the cat can recognize each other as being similarly sharing that experience. So I would posit that two agents can know that they share an experience just in case the following conditions hold. One, their bodies are similar in the relevant way, i.e. they share the same body schema. And two, their bodies are situated in the same way relative to the experienced phenomenon. They make the same localization in Samuel Todis's sense. That's all speculation. I'm going to wrap up the talk now. So let me just close by summarizing the arguments I've made so it sticks in your mind. So I argued that in order to know what the quantum world is like in QBism, we can't think about it as a world completely independent of agents, but we have to start with a world full of agents and we have to abstract them away. But to abstract them away, abstraction is a constructive process. We have to first abstractly define the agent. And to do that, we have to understand the relation between the agent and other agents, intersubjectivity. And intersubjectivity itself, as I've argued, is grounded in their bodies. And finally, these bodies must not be understood as objects. They are inhabitable frameworks, if you like. So I'm going to call them carrier bags of agency. They're kind of placeholders that any agent could occupy. So with that, let me finish with this nice rendition. So this is Ursula Le Guin's interpretation of a poem of Lao Tzu, which I think captures nicely this idea of bodies as carrier bags for agency. 30 spokes meet in the hub. Where the wheel isn't is where it's useful. Hollowed out, clay makes a pot. Where the pot's not is where it's useful. Cut doors and windows to make a room. Where the room isn't, there's room for you. So the profit in what is in the use of what isn't. Thanks. That's the end of my talk.
Great. Thanks very much, Jacques, for this very nice talk. Now we have a couple of minutes for discussion with the other speakers. So first of all, welcome to the other speakers, Emily, Daniele, and Lorenzo. So let me ask if one of the three of you would want to begin to say something or ask something to Jacques about the talk. Emily.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm also very interested in this question. I guess I don't find this take on intersubjectivity entirely satisfying because it seems to be sort of attributing a magical quality to bodies as opposed to other types of physical objects. Because, as I understand it, QBism sort of says that I can't in general look at a physical object and know that you are experiencing it in the same way as I am, but somehow I'm supposed to look at your body and see that from my point of view, it seems like you're situated similarly to me, and therefore infer that this is true from your perspective as well, even though I can't apparently do that in the case of other sort of physical objects. So I don't quite understand where the sort of magical role of bodies as being distinct from other types of physical objects can come from
Let me ask you a question about that. So when I look at the sun, I perceive it as burning hot, and it blinds me. And when I look at my sister, I see her as a living person who I love. Why do you say the second one is somehow magical and the first one isn't?
What I mean is that if I understand correctly what QBism is saying about this, and sometimes it's not entirely clear what QBism is saying about this, but it sort of seems as though when you and I are inspecting, say, quantum system, we're not allowed to assume that we're having the same experience of it. Kind of the resolution that QBism is supposed to offer of the measurement problem relies on the assumption that we can have different experiences of, say, a quantum system that we're measuring. So it's unclear to me how I'm supposed to infer that if I observe my sister and I seem to observe her as being in a similar physical situation to me, how I'm supposed to infer that she's having that same experience, and why the facts about the physical relation between our bodies are somehow different from the facts about other types of physical situations, physical systems that we might be observing.
I think a lot more could be said about this, but I will just say that based on what the phenomenologists say, we shouldn't think about it as an inference. It's closer to something like a perception.
I mean, again, that just seems like magic to me, that we're supposed to magically know things about other consciousnesses that we don't know about, other types of physical systems.
Does Daniel want to say something? I don't want to, because I disagree that it seems like magic, but I'm not really sure how to overcome that impasse. Okay.
Yeah, great. So I cannot resist but ask a question as the chair. So suppose I'm the only being on this planet. So maybe a disease has eradicated all other humans and animals. I'm just sitting here. I think I can still use quantum theory to find my way. I find some lasers lying around. I want to predict what I see, whether I hear a click or not. I can certainly use quantum theory to make successful predictions. And I can try to play the game that you mentioned, that I try to infer somehow about the way I use quantum mechanics, its formalism, and what I see about what this could tell me about the world. So in what sense do you think this intersubjectivity is crucial at all? So does QBism really need more than one observer? One agent?
I think your counterfactual there is laden with intersubjectivity. You're presupposing that there was a whole world of humans which made the lasers and created the theory and then suddenly disappeared. If you wanted to do a more accurate counterfactual for your question, you'd have to imagine that you were born miraculously into a world where you had no parents, no other humans around, and miraculously survived somehow. And you're telling me now you're going to build a laser and do quantum mechanics? I don't buy it.
Well, let me ask one follow-up on that. So what Chris is often giving us an example is that an agent doesn't have to be one specific person. So it could be a group of people that's coming to a conclusion, like he and his wife. That's one example he always gives. So if I say humanity as an agent that's successfully using quantum theory, and you can say what you just raised, you can certainly say that for humanity. Somehow we rose from the ashes of evolution and suddenly build lasers, and we use it without talking to other agents if we see ourselves as an agent. So doesn't this undermine your argument that you really need more than one agent for intersubjectivity?
Well, you could even pose the same thing in terms of, a single mind. If we want to take a single person as an agent, I think it's a fallacy to think that we ourselves are atomic consciousnesses. The fact is that if you look at findings in neuroscience, we know that if you separate the two halves of the brain, it seems like you almost have two different minds operating together within the same brain. And I think just looking at figures of speech, I argued with myself and so on. Actually, what we think of as a unified consciousness is never completely unified. It's always made up of different components, which could be, within certain limits, taken as consciousnesses in their own right. So I think we really have to get away from this idea of putting a boundary around some conscious entity and calling it a single consciousness. it never is a single consciousness, not even for an individual person.
Yes, okay. I would have a lot to follow up, but let's first ask Lorenzo, who's raising his hand, wants to also comment or say something.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit puzzled about the following. So I understand more or less like what is the ontology you're proposing, that I think you said is the word described by no particular agent. But then I was wondering why this is suggested by the way the QBists interpret quantum theory. So why this should be the quantum word in particular, because I mean, my take on QBism is that quantum theory just gives you a tool to make bets in this world. You could decide not to use the Bohr rule, for example. And then then how do you stipulate what is this word described by no particular agents in a world where each agent could bet on completely different things, not even following the Bohr rule, for example?
Yeah, it's tricky to answer that because I think there's many questions in there.
Yeah.
Here's one thought. What's significant? So yes, quantum theory is a tool in QBism, and what's significant about it is not that anyone uses it, but the fact that we know it is useful for certain things. So the idea is that that tells us something about the world in the sense that the world has to be a certain way in order for that tool to be useful. We can easily imagine worlds in which quantum theory would not be a useful tool. The experiments we've done could have come out differently such that Bell inequalities were not violated, for example. So that tells us that, the fact that quantum theory is a useful tool in certain cases, not always, tells us something about the world. And that's not in conflict with the fact that other tools might be more useful for different jobs. Each tool kind of accesses, if you like, a different corner of the world. And the other point is the reason why we really can't talk about the world without talking about agents and their tools is just that in QBism, it's very thoroughly first person. So we have to start with where we are, where we actually begin as agents in experience. And from there, we proceed to a world that is by degrees more and more independent of ourselves. And my argument is that we get there by a process of abstracting ourselves away. And because of the nature of that process, the final product will always bear some traces of us in its form.
Okay, yeah. We have Daniele raising his hand. Hi, Daniele.
Yeah, hello. So thanks for the talk. I have a question that in fact relates to the last things you said in reply to our colleague. So QBism starts with the idea that quantum mechanics is a tool used by an agent to act and interact with the world. And normally my reluctance to embrace QBism would come from the impression that if you start from that and you take for granted indeed the agency on the one hand and the fact that you just have a tool, you are at risk of not posing enough questions about what indeed makes an agent and what type of tool we have and so on. So I'm very happy that there is this ongoing work about trying to clarify better what we mean by agency and how it relates to other agents. But I want to ask about the other side of the story. So even if we take on board the idea that quantum mechanics and maybe any scientific theory, any scientific model is a normative tool. Well, it's a particular type of tool that it's designed to have a representational role. Even if we don't believe that our theory just represent the world as it is, and they are in fact normative to a large extent, they are a particular type of normative tools. They're like maps, so they are definitely tools and they're definitely constructed, but to do something, and what they do is to some extent represent the world out there. So I wanted to ask you to say more about this other side of the story.
I wish I could say more about this, but I very much agree with what you're saying. that the theories that we build, as you put it, are designed to have a representative function. And I would argue because it facilitates the usage of that tool to be able to think about it like a map of the world. And I think this is very connected to a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone called Objectivity by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, where they study the history of the idea of objectivity in science and using maps, exactly using maps and atlases as their case study. And so I do think it is important to build theories that can play a representational role. But in order to do that effectively, we always have to keep in mind that this representation is kind of convenient fiction, if you like, that facilitates the tool use. And this is exactly why QBism is still striving for something like an ontology. We're trying to find what will be the useful map of quantum theory that could play a representational role. But in order to do that, we have to be a little bit skeptical and say, that's just a role that it plays. It's a convenient fiction. This really is an act of construction and design. It's not given to us by metaphysics.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. So we have more opportunity for discussion in the question and answer session at the end of this day. So thanks, Jacques, again for the nice talk.